get this started. All right. Welcome, guys. Today, hopefully, my plan is, Lord willing, that we'll finish our journey in looking at the eschatology, and we'll get back to the class, the assignments and things like that, Lord willing, next week. But today, I wanted to focus our attention really on, hopefully, I think it'll be the final topic. We'll see how far we get today. But we've been spending much of our time, the last several sessions, on the millennium. Looked at several different views of the millennium, try to at least get an introduction or general idea of the millennial views, the more popular ones anyway. And with that, it's also helpful and important. I wanted to talk about today the tribulation and the rapture. And again, we won't be able to go into all the details, spend a lot of time, but I just want to sort of, by way of an introduction and overview, just cover some of the basic aspects of the tribulation and the rapture. We've already looked at the main passages, so we're just really going to revisit them with specific focus on these particular topics, particularly the tribulation at the beginning. And so with that, what is the tribulation? I think what I'd like us to do is we're going to read from Matthew 24 in a moment. But in Matthew 24, he speaks of this great tribulation, not just tribulation. He calls it a great tribulation. And then he says something that tells us it's going to be unlike any other period of time in human history, when he says such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now. And so that's quite a statement, because if we think about the events in human history and all the things that have happened over the many centuries, there have been some pretty significant catastrophes around the world. I think of the bubonic plague, right? It's killed somewhere around 25 million people in the medieval times, about a quarter of the population in Europe. There was a great famine in China about 60 or 70 years ago, where 43 million people died in a famine. Of course, we had the world wars in the last century, and there's some estimates there of how many died, nearly 70 million people in each of those wars. And then the flood itself, which occurred in the days of Noah, which some estimate the population could have been up to 1 billion people. We don't know for sure, but basically everyone on earth died except for one particular family. And so as we consider those events, and then Jesus says, well, there's going to be something that's worse than has ever happened. So that's a pretty significant statement. As great as the Great Tribulation promises to be, then more devastating than anything else the world has seen. And when we look at the book of Revelation, which describes some of the events of the tribulation, and we sort of total up, at times it mentions a half of the earth or a quarter of the earth or a third of the earth would die. When you total up all of those events prior to Jesus' second coming, at least 75% of the Earth's population is going to die during the Great Tribulation. And if that were to happen in our time, that would be like 6 billion people. And then, of course, many more will die at the second coming, when all of Christ's enemies gather around Jerusalem and he destroys them all. So you're looking at, most of the Earth population is going to perish in the tribulation. And so certainly that would qualify it as a great tribulation, a great time of affliction. So what I wanted to do first is look back at Daniel, because Jesus also speaks of a time when, actually, why don't I have this passage here? Let me put these verses up. I didn't show this. Here we go. Let me just put this here. I'll have one of you guys read it for us. Okay. Let me ask John to go ahead. Can you read here Matthew 24, verse 15 and 21? I just took out those two verses from the Olivet Discourse.
Yes, Pastor Tim. Matthew 24:15 and 21. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will.
Okay, so those were the two statements that I mentioned. Notice he says a great tribulation will take place, and then he defines it for us when he says such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world. So this would be the greatest time of affliction or trouble or distress that the earth has ever seen. Again, that's a pretty significant statement. Now notice Jesus gives an indication as to when this will occur. He doesn't give us an exact date, but he does say there's going to be a particular sign that will be an indication of this great tribulation. And that sign is the abomination of desolation. And then Jesus even identifies who mentions that, the prophet Daniel. So here Jesus is very specific. Again, he says there's going to be a great tribulation, a great time of distress that has not happened in human history. And that will take place when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about. So let's go back and remind ourselves, well, what was this abomination of desolation that Daniel was referring to? And can we get more details as to what time period this is? So let me go to the next passage here, again from Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27, a passage we looked at in the past. I'm going to see if Jesse, if you can see this on your phone there, can you read verses 24 to 26 or 25? And then Joshua, if you could read 26 through 27 here. Jesse, can you hear me? Oh, maybe his phone's frozen. Joshua, I'll just have you go ahead. Can you read the whole thing then?
Yes, sure.
Thanks.
70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 72 weeks. 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood, even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate.
Okay, there's a lot here. Again, this is something, if you go back to probably what session is this? 20, maybe back to session 21 or 2, we talked about this passage in detail. But if you remember, the 70 weeks that he describes here is literally 70 sevens. All right, 70 periods of time that are made up of sevens. And given that it can't be referring to weeks or days or even months, because of the time frame here, he talks about the Jerusalem being rebuilt. It has to be years. And notice he says there will be 69 sevens between the time that Jerusalem is rebuilt, that was in the days of Nehemiah, from then until the coming of the Messiah will be 69 weeks, or I forget how many years, 400 and something years, but that 445 years or something like that. But basically from the days of the wall being rebuilt to the time of Christ. And so then, as you go through the passage, you notice he doesn't bring up the 70th week until he mentions the 1 week, the remaining week, in verse 27. And so verse 26 really is a period of time that he skips, where he says at the time period the Messiah is going to be cut off. And then he mentions the prince of the enemy, but there's actually a gap in time between the Messiah being cut off and the people of the prince to come, right? So here, right in that little space there, right in this little tiny space right here, is basically from the time that Jesus died and rose again until the 70th week. Okay, so even little tiny spaces in the Bible can be long periods of time, right? So here, this last week, this 70th week, which I highlighted here, I'll even mention the 70th 7 actually, is mentioned in verse 27. Okay, and in that 70th 7 or 70th week, this prince who is to come is going to make a covenant. And then in the middle of that 7, the middle of the week, it says he will break that covenant. And notice he uses the term the wing of abominations. You guys see that? One who makes desolate. All right, that is the term or the phrase that Jesus refers to in Matthew 24. He summarized it, the abomination of desolation, as he described it. And so on the wing of the abomination, one who makes desolate, that will happen in the middle of this 70th 7. Okay, now we don't know when this 70th 7 begins. Like I said, there's a big space here in, where is it again? Verse 26. Yeah, right here. Maybe I should highlight it in gray here. Oop. Now let me try it. I can't get it to highlight. Anyway, right in here. In that space. Let me do this. There. Okay. Wow. I can't get it to highlight. Anyway, so again, we've talked about this a little bit. Well, now I want to bring some clarity as to what is that 70th 7? What does that involve? What does that entail? Notice if we go back to what Jesus said about that there's going to be a tribulation, right? What will be the sign of this great tribulation? Well, exactly what Daniel said in Daniel 9:27, the abomination of desolation. So what Jesus says, Jesus is unveiling, or he's revealing the 70th week here. He's telling the disciples, he's describing in this 70th 7, there's going to be a great tribulation that will take place. And remember, the abomination of desolation is in the middle of that 70th 7, the middle of that 7-year period of time. Okay? You guys with me so far? Any questions? Okay, make sure if you do have any, stop me, because I want to make this is important. That I want you to be able to track with me. Now, this is something very important as well. Daniel 12, verse 11, Daniel himself refers back to this abomination of desolation. And he says this in verse 11 of Daniel 12. from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, okay, and that is something that he says right here. He will put a stop to the sacrifice. He says that in Daniel 9:27. Then Daniel repeats it later in Daniel 12, verse 11. And then Daniel mentions again the abomination of desolation that is set up. Notice he says there will be 1,290 days. He gives a period of time. So that again confirms he's speaking about the same event here in Daniel 12:11 as he is in Daniel 9:27. Again, there's two reasons we see that. He mentions this regular sacrifice being abolished. He mentions the abomination of desolation. And then he confirms that this 70th seven is 7 years, because he says there will be 1,290 days from the time that the sacrifice is abolished. That's the abomination of desolation. When it's set up, there's going to be this 3.5 year period to the end is the idea here. So 1,290 days. Well, how many? That is equal to 43 months, which equals in the lunar calendar 42, which equals 3.5 years. And then Daniel indicates there'll be an extra month. Okay? 1,260 days is 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Okay? And so Daniel mentions 1,290 days. Okay, so now we're getting some specificity as to the timing here that's involved. Again, when we start in Daniel 9, he says 77s. We assume the sevens refers to years. And here it's affirmed later in Daniel that, yes, indeed, that is referring to years. Jesus then, when he comes, he points back to Daniel's prophecy and identifies that when that abomination of desolation occurs, in the middle of the 70th week, in the middle of this 7-year time period, there will be this abomination of desolation. When that happens, a great tribulation will come about. A great time of distress, such as the world has never seen. That great. Okay? And here I just summarized that. So what that gives us then is Jesus mentions in Matthew 24, he's giving us, he's not telling us when this tribulation period will start in history, but he is telling us that when you see this abomination of desolation, then you know that this great tribulation, the second, that half of the 70th seven will take place. So this is sort of a visual representation of what we're talking about here. Okay, so right now we're in the church age, of course, right? And we don't know when this will end. We don't know when the tribulation begins. Okay, this line here is the beginning of the tribulation. We don't know when that is, when it's going to start. But we do know that when it does start, the clock is ticking, that there are only 7 years left until the second coming. Later in Matthew 24, Jesus mentions the second coming will take place after these things, meaning after the great tribulation. Jesus says that he will return on the clouds. Remember that verse there? And so we have an exact detail of the end time period once the tribulation begins. And when does it begin? The treaty, the covenant that is made with, here, let me put the passage in here, right? The covenant that is mentioned, I think it's in verse 25 of Daniel chapter 9. Is that right? No, sorry, Daniel 27. Right? He mentions the covenant, and then Daniel also mentions in Daniel 9:27 that there will be this abomination that will take place. He repeats it in 12:11. And then Jesus in Matthew 24 indicates that he will return after this great tribulation. Okay? Now, Daniel also notes there's going to be this short little period of time just before here we can put in this short 1 month period Daniel mentions right before the, sorry, not the eternal state, the Millennial Kingdom. You guys should have caught me on this. That was a test. Nobody found that. Okay, the Millennial Kingdom, and then comes the eternal state after the Millennial Kingdom, right? Which is 1,000 years. And then the eternal state. Okay, so, I mean, we have an exact, if we put these passages together, again, along with Revelation 20, which mentions the time of the Millennial Kingdom, we have a very detailed and exact mapping out of the chronology and the specific time of the end. Now, we don't know, like I said, we don't know here how long it's going to be until the tribulation begins, right? Jesus said no one knows the day or the hour. And so when it begins, we're not sure. But once it begins, we know exactly what's going to happen. Okay? The tribulation is 7 years, and then the great tribulation takes place in the last 3.5 years that Jesus describes in Matthew 24, 21, I think. Okay? So just these few passages, you can easily identify the timing here of these events. Now, this supposes that, you know, again, as we talk about the details here, this supposes that these passages are all literal. Okay, we're just using normal rules of grammar and background context, authorial intent to identify, you know, as Daniel is speaking to the people in his day, he's not using symbolic or figurative language there. He's describing 70 7-year periods of time. And again, he gives an exact reference to the time between the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem, of the city of Jerusalem, and the coming of Messiah. Okay, that's literal, right? I mean, we can look at history and we can add up the numbers. And it's like, that's exactly what happened. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't figurative. Daniel was giving us, God through Daniel was giving us a very specific timeline between, All right, Jose. Somehow Sandy took over the screen here. How did you do that? Sandy, what happened there? Did you guys see something funny on the screen?
We don't see anything on the screen.
Uh-oh. Can you see me on the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. That was weird. So, as I said, Daniel was being literal in Daniel chapter 9. So he's speaking, because you can't, if you look at the passage, you can't take one verse out and say, oh, well, that verse is literal, but the next verse is not. You can't do that. Unless there's some obvious statement in the passage, and there's not. He's just describing a period of time. He just says that the Lord has decreed 70 weeks in verse 24, and then he describes the details of those 70 weeks in the next few verses. And he says the first 69 weeks will be between the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the coming of Messiah, the first coming. And then Daniel jumps ahead in time. There's a gap between week 69 and week 70. Week 70 is what ushers in the second coming. Okay, and so the Lord is keeping the timing of the events surrounding the second coming a mystery. He doesn't tell us how many weeks or how many sevens between the week 69 and week 70. He leaves that as a mystery. But what he does do is tell exactly when the first coming will be, and then he tells us exactly what's going to happen in the time period of the second coming, that there's going to be a 7-year period of time, and in that what will begin that period of time is the covenant that this man referred to as the prince of the enemy of Jerusalem will make a covenant and then break that covenant in the middle of that 7-year period. That's literal. That's going to happen. That's not symbolic. It's not figurative. It doesn't represent anything else but simply that this ruler will make a covenant, and the many is assumed to be Israel, because he then describes this abomination of desolation after that. Okay, I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to emphasize here, this is a key passage that you can really rest on to give understanding of the premillennial point of view, and that there will be a tribulation. There will be in the future a literal 7-year period of time, which is a tribulation. How do we know that? Because Jesus, again speaking literally in Matthew 24, points back to Daniel 9. Okay, so those two passages are linked together, Daniel 9, Matthew 24, and we could throw in Daniel 12 as affirming the detail, but even without Daniel 12, we can know quite a bit just from Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27, and then Matthew 24, especially verses 15 and following. And also in Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking of, he's answering the disciples' questions. If you remember, right, Jesus said that the temple will be destroyed, basically, right? But he says his temple will be raised up. And then the disciples say, well, when is this going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? And when will be the end? And so Jesus answers them literally in Matthew 24. He said, well, fellas, let me tell you how you're going to know what's going to happen at the end. All right. When you see the abomination of desolation, and then, by the way, the author, Matthew, says, let the reader understand. So Matthew recognized it hadn't happened yet in his day, but would be sometime yet future. So he writes a note to the reader. So he says, basically, hey, reader, when you see the abomination of desolation, then get ready, because the great tribulation will begin. That's what Jesus said. And then following that great tribulation, he will return. Brothers, I just don't know how you can get around that being that there's not a literal 7-year period of time called the tribulation. It's really, really difficult for me. I mean, I know the arguments used and how guys approach that, but honestly, you really have to make everything said in Daniel 9 be a figurative or symbolic kind of statements, and Matthew 24 then has to be symbolic or figurative, right? Because Jesus is pointing back to Daniel 9. And if Daniel 9 was figurative, then Jesus must be speaking figuratively. So he's not really answering the disciples' question then. He's talking about something else, I guess. But that doesn't make any sense. You can't read the text plainly and come to that conclusion, in my opinion. And that of many others, by the way. That's the premillennial position, that there certainly is a 7-year period of time that is referred to as, by Daniel, the 70th seven, and by Jesus as a time of tribulation, of great tribulation, that second half. And that is what then, once that ends, it will usher in the second coming. Okay? So that's what gives us this little timeline here. Again, we don't know when this particular event is going to come about. Okay, that event is is not known, that starting point, but we do know what event will initiate that starting point, right? This covenant made by a ruler, presumably with the people of Israel. Okay, now I mentioned the Antichrist Treaty, and I'll tell you why I do that a little bit later if we have time to look at another passage. But we certainly know from Daniel it will be a ruler. He's called a prince of basically the enemies of Israel, and so we know there'll be some ruler who's an enemy of Israel, or rules people who are enemies of Israel, that he will make a treaty. And since he's an enemy making a treaty, it has to be with the people of Israel. Okay? All right. Questions or comments at this point? This is partly review, but it's something we talked about a few months ago. But I'm trying to bring it all together right now, just to show you, try to convince you, if you weren't already convinced, this is literal. And if you get into discussions with other brothers who have a different viewpoint, just take them first to Daniel 9 and just say, okay, what's being described here? Is this literal or not? And they're going to have trouble getting around that, the literal statement of the first coming between the building of Jerusalem and the Messiah. And then the Messiah is cut off, right? Jesus was killed. So they're going to have trouble getting around. That's literal. So then the 70th week has to be literal also, because it's all bound up in that passage. And then Jesus, you can take them to the Olivet Discourse where Jesus references that text. Again, speaking in a literal sense, answering the disciples' questions. Okay? All right. Is that clear? Do you guys have any questions?
Pastor Tim,
Yes, Sandy.
in Daniel 9:27 Antichrist Treaty, does it mean that the temple has already been built and he will make this treaty in the temple? The third
Yes.
temple?
Yes. Daniel 9 alludes to that. And I think in 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2, we see evidence of that actually happens. The temple will be built because sacrifices are going to be made in the temple. And the abomination of desolation has to do with something the Antichrist does in the temple.
Could
And
if Pastor Tim,
yeah.
if it could be the case that it means that Christians could see the treaty, could be witness the treaty?
Well, the treaty, it says the treaty literally is going to be made with the many, who in Daniel 9, the context there would be the people of Israel. So this would be a national treaty. This is not made with the believers. It's not made with the church. It's made with Israel.
Okay.
Okay? National Israel. So this will be a national political treaty, not a religious one.
Yes, because today we're watching at what happened to Ukraine right now, and Ukraine has become an allied with Turkey, and we know that the Antichrist will reign, and Israel become an allied of Saudi Arabia right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's
what has happened?
Interesting. I mean, some people think, that the Antichrist is, will be the Pope. Other people think he might come out of a Muslim country who's able to make peace between the Arab world and Israel. But we don't know yet. But we do know. Sorry?
I heard some preachers that the Antichrist will come from a Muslim country, because a Muslim country also is part of Abraham's descendant, and they will accept it because they're brothers.
Yeah, that could be. We don't know for sure. That's a possible scenario, possible situation. But the Bible doesn't give that level of detail. It doesn't tell us where the Antichrist will come from specifically. But it does say that he will be a ruler who will make, there'll be a ruler who will make this treaty with Israel, and then break it.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah, Jesse.
Yeah.
Daniel 9:26 says that the prince of the the prince of the people, or the people of the prince who is to come, will destroy the temple. And I think it was fulfilled during 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple under General Titus. So could this mean that the Antichrist would come from the revived Roman Empire?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's good reason to believe he's going to come out of Europe, because Rome, right, conquered much of Europe in the days, 70 AD, right? So yeah, I believe that there is some evidence that, this prince, this ruler, is going to be somehow associated with Rome, with Europe in particular. So but we don't have specificity. Is he going to come from Turkey? Is he going to come from Italy? Is he going to come? But that's why some people think it's the Pope, because that's in the same region. And but so there's interesting theories out there. So we have a general idea, I think anyway, that since we know the Romans destroyed the temple, if that's what Daniel is referring to in verse 26, then that tells us this prince is somebody that will be connected in some way to the Roman Empire. But we don't have much, we can't really get too specific beyond that, whether he's actually from Rome, from Italy, or from a neighboring country, or just somewhere in the empire. At least I can't see it being any more specific there. Do you have any thoughts, Jesse?
That's all, Pastor Tim. Thank you.
Okay, good observation. All right, so let's talk about this abomination of desolation. What is it? Is there any indication or information elsewhere in the Bible that tells us? Daniel doesn't give specifics. He just says the sacrifices will be cut off and there'll be an abomination of desolation. I believe 2 Thessalonians Chapter 2 provides some insight for us as to what will be involved in this event. So let's see. I'm going to ask Jesse, can you read verses 1 to 6? And then let's see. Pastor Ramil, I'm going to ask you to read verses 8 to 12 here. Okay.
And let's see in my screen, Pastor Tim, verse 1. Thank you. Thank you. It says, "Now we request you, brethren, with regards to the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you might not be quickly shaken from the composure or be disturbed either by the spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? And you know what retains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed."
Then that lawless one will be revealed from the Lord, will slay with the breath of his mouth, and bring it to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, so as to be saved.
And then through verse 12.
For this reason, God will send upon them the deluding influence so that they will believe that what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness.
Okay. So as we look at this passage, we notice first that the term abomination of desolation doesn't occur here. All right. So we need to admit that up front. However, notice a few key statements. Paul says he's going to speak about the coming of our Lord Jesus, right? And he mentions here, where is it? The day of the Lord in verse 2, right? Yeah, here it is. Okay, so notice here he sets the context as far as the time frame is concerned here. He's speaking of the time period around the second coming and the day of the Lord. Remember, from our understanding of Old Testament prophets, prophetic passages, the day of the Lord is a time period of judgment on the nations. Joel chapter 3 gives very specific details that the nations will be gathered in the valley of judgment to be judged. All right, which I would say this is the time period of the tribulation, because there's a period of judgment followed by the coming of the Messiah. Okay, and that's what Paul refers to in the first two verses here. The coming of our Lord and the day of the Lord. And he says, let no one in any way deceive you. It won't come until this apostasy comes first. Okay? Now, apostasy here means rebellion, a defiance of authority. And so he's indicating there's going to be an apostasy. Well, that sounds a lot like an abomination of desolation, doesn't it? There's going to be some act of rebellion or this terrible act of defiance that's going to take place around the time period of the day of the Lord. And what will that apostasy be? Well, this man of lawlessness will be revealed. He's called the son of destruction, who opposes, so this is the idea of apostasy, exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as God. I believe that is what a reference to the abomination of desolation. Okay, again, I admit that term's not used here in this text. However, he's speaking of end times events. He's speaking of the time period that we know involves that 70th seven, the day of the Lord. And he says in that time period, that's not going to happen until we see this. There's going to be an apostasy that takes place in that time period, where this man of lawlessness is going to oppose every God and even claim himself to be God, the God, in God's temple. I believe that is the abomination of desolation. Okay? It just fits with what we understand from Daniel 9 and Daniel 12, and even what in Matthew 24, what Jesus says, and even the description of the day of the Lord in Obadiah, in Joel chapter 3, in Zephaniah, chapter 1 and 2, that there's going to be this in the day of the Lord, this day of time of judgment and destruction from God. But Paul's telling her, look, this hasn't come yet. Jesus hasn't returned yet. We haven't entered into the day of the Lord yet, because you haven't seen this apostasy yet. Okay, and again, that's this idea of some terrible event that's going to take place in the time period of the day of the Lord. And what is that apostasy? When some man claims to be God. Now, what is interesting is in Daniel chapter 11, there is a reference to an abomination of desolation that takes place in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. where he went into the temple and sacrificed a pig. That was called an abomination of desolation, where he desecrated the temple of the Lord. So it would make sense that the abomination of desolation that Daniel's talking about in Daniel 9 would also in some way be connected to a desecration of the temple. Okay, again, I'm just inferring connections here, all right? I'm not saying this is explicitly being mentioned in the text, but I think we can make these reasonable connections in the passage. And I believe, that's why I believe the abomination of desolation. In fact, let me give you the reference to this in Daniel chapter 11 that I mentioned here. Again, we did talk about this. Those of you that were there might remember when we went through Daniel 11. And this is the time period. This is happening, taking place before the coming of the Messiah. And speaking of basically what happens when the empire of Greece is split up, right? There's Babylon, then Persia, then Greece. And so chapter 11 is speaking of what happens when in the time of the Greece, when Greece rules, Greece will be broken up, and he describes these different kingdoms. Okay. And then he mentions, let me see if I can find it here. Yes. How one of these kings that rises up out of this will set up the abomination of desolation. And we know historically that actually took place when Antiochus Epiphanes entered in the temple and defied God and blasphemed God and sacrificed a pig. And then that's when the Maccabees rose up and they defeated the Seleucids, and that's when we get Hanukkah and all that. You can read about it in Maccabees, actually. It's not a biblical book, but it is a helpful book historically. Okay, so here's a reference in Daniel 11:31 of this abomination of desolation, which is not the same one, all right? Because this abomination of desolation in Daniel 11 takes place before the coming of the Messiah. So this is a different one, but it is a reference to, we know historically, had to do with a desecration within God's temple. All right. Okay, so that's why I believe 2 Thessalonians 11, Paul here is actually speaking of the abomination of desolation without describing it with that term. And I don't know why he doesn't, but the events he describes here certainly is consistent with that. Okay. And then he mentions more about the lawless one in the verses which follow in 2 Thessalonians, where he describes him there as following the activity of Satan, and he'll have powers and signs. And by the way, we see this in the book of Revelation with the Antichrist, don't we? And so that's how we know, based on Revelation, book of Revelation, we know that the man of lawlessness is the Antichrist. All right. And then if that is the case, he is the prince described in Daniel 9:27. If the man of lawlessness is the one that commits the abomination of desolation, I believe he is, then that is the same guy as the prince of the enemy of Israel. All right?
Pastor Tim.
Yeah, Jesse.
Is Antiochus Epiphanes the fulfillment of the prophecy in Daniel 11?
Yes.
The ultimate fulfillment, Pastor Tim?
Yeah, Daniel 11 is speaking of time past. For Daniel, it was time future. He's talking of the Grecian kingdom and the kings that followed. For us, he's speaking of a past event. Because we know that because toward the end of Daniel 11, he begins speaking of the coming of the Messiah. All right, but that doesn't happen till after this this particular abomination of desolation. So that Daniel chapter 11 is referring to events that took place around the time period of 200 BC, somewhere in there, 175 BC.
Another thing, Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
Second Thessalonians 2, verse 1, says the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him. Does this sounds like rapture, our gathering together to him?
Well, remember the saints are also gathered when he returns, right? They come down out of heaven with him.
At the tribulation saints.
Well, if you remember Revelation 19, and it says Jesus is coming down on the white horse, right? And who is following him?
Yeah.
Right, the host of heaven clothed in white, which elsewhere in Revelation is a reference to the saints. So I believe you could take it two ways. One, yeah, you could say that is the rapture, the gathering to him, but the saints are also gathered to him when he returns. Or if you're looking at, if Paul's speaking of the time period as a whole, all of tribulation, then those two events take place in that 7-year period. Not at the same time, but it seems like here, verses 1 and 2, he's talking about the whole time period. So what he could be saying, if he is referring to the rapture, I believe he's just saying, he's not saying those happen at the same time, unless I think he's referring to the day of the Lord, the events as a whole, the whole time period, the whole 7 years. Because he mentions day of the Lord there as well.
Because there are those who holds post-trib
Yeah.
that would fall into this passage.
Yeah, but that's one short phrase, and it could be interpreted a few different ways. So it has to be consistent with other passages like 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, which maybe, I don't know if we'll get to those today or not. But yeah, it has to, yeah, I know guys have, debated with me about this and say, this is the rapture. Well, okay, then what does 1 Thessalonians 4 mean? And he says here, if that's the rapture, or that it's the second coming, and that's when we're gathered to him. The day of the Lord is not one day in that time period. The day of the Lord spans the entire tribulation, including the second coming, by the way. So one could argue that the coming of our Lord and the gathering is referring to the rapture, and not the second coming. Right? I mean,
Pastor Tim, is it possible that in verse 1, Paul was speaking of two different events, the second coming and the rapture, but starting verse 2, he zeroed in on the second coming?
Yeah, I think it's
because he starting verse 2, he keeps on mentioning the day of the Lord and describe.
And again, remember, day of the Lord is a period of judgment on the nations. That's that which we would see, what I would see as the tribulation period. It's not just one day or one event. It's actually a time period based on what we learn in the Old Testament prophecies about the day of the Lord. Okay, good question. Let's go a little further here. Let's see, I think I already talked about this. In the book of Revelation, a couple of passages there. Because some say, well, the tribulation is not mentioned explicitly in Revelation, that there's no reference to this 7-year period of time. But I would beg to differ, because I think there's a couple of passages here that indicate this. Let me come back to you, John. Could you read these two passages from Revelation here, Revelation 11, verse 2 and Revelation 13, 5?
Yes, Pastor Tim. Revelations chapter 11, verse 2. Leave out the court which is outside the temple and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Revelations 13, verse 5. There was given to the beast a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him.
Okay, notice here, 42 months. You see that in both passages? How long is that in years?
3.5.
Yeah, right? 42
3.5.
months equals 3.5 years, huh? That's interesting, isn't it? We're seeing in Revelation these events of God's wrath being poured out on the earth, and here's these two passages which reference a time period of 3.5 years, which, wow, haven't we already heard about in a few different passages, the 3.5-year time period in the days of tribulation? And then notice here, they will tread underfoot the holy city for 3.5 years. And then the beast will have authority for 3.5 years. Okay, so there'll be a period of time where the Antichrist is given free rein, so to speak, to do as he pleases, and the enemies will subjugate Jerusalem for this period of time. Remember, guys, the man of lawlessness, or the prince of the enemies of Israel, or I believe this is the Antichrist, it said in Daniel 9, he will make a covenant, right? Things will be fine, but then after 3.5 years, he'll break that covenant. And then for the next 3.5 years, there will be attacks on Jerusalem, ending with all the enemies of God surrounding the city. And I think that's what's being referred to here. And so I believe there is a direct reference in the book of Revelation to a time period, the 3.5 years, in which is half of the tribulation, where the Antichrist will have full reign and power to to attack Israel. Okay, so those are just two things to consider or recognize. So, and as we're thinking about the book of Revelation, I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of its structure. Again, many don't see it as literal. They see it as sort of this symbolic description of the conflict between the church and the enemies of God, and that it's just describing it in a more symbolic or figurative or picturesque way. But we would hold that no, it's a book that is describing literal events in the future. And so we need to understand or recognize that. How do we know that? Well, one, it's given as a purpose, the purpose statement. Remember, Jesus tells John, or John says, that this is what will take place. So he's told to write down for the 7 churches the events that will take place, and then Jesus gives him an outline. The things which you have seen, past, the things which are present, and that includes the letters to the churches that he writes, and then the things which are about to be. So that's future. And that's the rest of the book. Okay, so we see in the purpose, there's a future idea the future events perspective in Revelation. We see in the outline, there's a clear structure that Jesus describes and the book follows it as far as chronologically. And then the structure of the book, and this is kind of hard to show on Microsoft Word formatting, but basically here's a general overview of the structure of the book of Revelation. That there are events described in heaven and events on earth. And what's interesting is the events described in heaven come at what are called interludes. So the first, in the beginning, we have events from heaven, like when Jesus comes down. Then we have the church age, and chapters 2 and 3 are the present age, where the churches are described. Then we have this interlude, where we again are given the scene in heaven. And then verses 6 to 19 describe the tribulation period, ending in the second coming. Then again, we have sort of this, the Millennial Kingdom, this interlude, so to speak, in 19 and part of 20. The millennium's described in 20, and then the eternal state in 21 and 22. Okay? Yeah. This won't line up perfectly, but just gives you a general idea. And then we have the seals, 7 seals, which then usher in the 7 trumpets, and then the bowls. And it's right around the last trumpet is when the great tribulation begins, where you see these severe, the severe pouring out of God's wrath upon the earth. Okay. This is just a general idea. The structure clearly follows a chronology, and it's speaking of a past event in chapter 1 when John saw Jesus, present event in chapter 2 and 3 in the letters to the churches, future events, chapter 6 and following, the rest of the book. All right. And we discussed the structure of the book and these things in detail when we looked at Revelation 19 and 20 before. So you can go back to those sessions to get more details. But just by way of reminder, just describing to you Revelation in that way. Now, so any questions so far then on this tribulation period? My goal has been to try to show you the foundations biblically of understanding the tribulation as a literal 7-year period of time, which encompasses the events of the day of the Lord, and beginning with the covenant being made, including the abomination of desolation, and then ending with the second coming.
Pastor
Okay.
Tim,
Yeah.
in your graph, the tribulations, the seal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then the 6, then the blows of the first trumpet, then the bowls. My question is, in the seal, first seal, second seal, because in the seal was part of the false prophet, the false teachers are coming. Does it mean that we are in the person because we are the witness of this false prophet and false teachers in our world today?
I'm sorry, repeat that last part. I didn't quite hear everything in your
Because
question.
the seal was, there is a part of the seal which is the war. There is also a false prophet and false teachers. When Christ opened the seal, this is the sign of the seals. And now today we are the witness of this false teachers, false prophet, and also we have the witness of war right now, and even the famine because of what was happening in the world right now. My question is, are we now concluding, or what your opinion in the part of the seal? Are part of this witness of the seal right now?
Well, remember, Jesus said there will be many false Christs that will rise up. All right. So there's going to be, and Paul warns about false prophets and false teachers. So those guys.
Yes, that was in Matthew.
Yeah.
Jesus told us that there will be a rising of these prophets and this kind of false prophet. Then also we need to understand that in Revelation, this is also the word of Jesus Christ in regards to the sign of the seal. In Matthew, he did not give us the sign of the seal, but he make it clarification in the book of Revelations in this about the seal, that in the opening of the seal, verse 1, 2, 3, the sign, some of the sign of the Matthew in Matthew have Jesus speaking has happening in our time today.
Right,
What do
but
you
it was happening in the days of the apostles as well, right? Jude talks about these false prophets. Paul talks about these false prophets. Second Peter talks about these false prophets. So, yeah, there's been, these guys have been around really throughout history. So, and they'll be around at the end as well. But we have yet to see the false prophet and the Antichrist. But there have been many who have existed over the course of history. So that's all that to say is that doesn't mean we are certainly in the last days now, though we could be, right?
Yeah, because today it very the evidence now what Jesus told in Matthew 24 are very clear at our present time right now.
Right, but we don't have any certainty of that because it's been that way in the past as well. So
And
Today is global, worldwide.
yeah,
Okay.
so was World War II. So was World War I. So
and also, Pastor Tim, I think the seal judgment mentioned that 1/3 of the population will die
yeah,
all
we
at the
haven't
same time.
yeah,
So
we haven't
didn't-
seen any of these judgments yet.
Yeah,
These
did
are
not-
massive.
yeah, we did not experience it yet.
No, COVID-19 is nowhere near
Yeah,
the effect of what we see in the Revelation, even with the first seal.
and also the stars falling, earthquake that could move mountains, and was not yet happened.
Yeah,
I think we can really be sure that we are not yet in the period of first of the seal judgment. Pastor Sunday,
No.
it's not mid-trib.
no, and again, we'd have to say then, the covenant hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been any treaty made with the people of Israel. And the temple hasn't been rebuilt. So the sacrifices have not been reinstituted. So, I mean, there are certain things that have to be in place before the tribulation is going to begin. In addition
But-
to, false prophets and false Christs and everything that will be around.
But Pastor Tim, Dr. John MacArthur said that all these happenings presently are just but preview of what will happen in the tribulation period.
Yeah.
What's your comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree. Small preview. Again, nothing like it will be, but yeah, certainly we're seeing, events around the world. And part of that is because we have access to social media, which shows us events around the world. 50 years ago, we wouldn't know all of the things we know now about everything going on around the whole world, right? We didn't have internet and, iPhones and all of these things to tell us what's happening.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
is it possible that with the Christians, we can witness, we can see the Antichrist reigning? Because
That he might be alive today. Yeah, it's possible.
After
Sure.
kan GC ka.
Yeah, he could be alive now. Again, because and we'll talk about this next week.
Regards ko GC naman. Kung makita ka.
We'll look at this next week because right, this idea of imminence that the church could be raptured at any moment. So that means, certainly it's possible that he's alive now and the tribulation is not far ahead. It's possible that he won't be alive for another 100 years, or we don't know. But it's, it is definitely a possibility that he's alive now. We just don't have any indication yet. And we'll talk about, like I said, next week, we'll look at the rapture passages a little bit and talk about sort of this this idea of nearness and sort of what event is it that's going to be connected with the beginning of the tribulation. All right, and sort of how that fits. But I want to give us enough time to cover that together. So I'm gonna hold off till next week to do that. Okay. As I mentioned before, not all of you were here, but I did mention that I talked with Pastor Mel, and we have identified the last week in June as starting June 27, when we will be able to gather together for module 4 in person. Okay, so I'm planning to come there. As long as things stay open, planning to come there, be there in Cebu the last week of June 27 to July 2. Okay, so make sure to mark that on your calendars. Let the other brothers know. I'll send out some information as well. But so I'd like, for us to be able to meet together and try to regroup and recover what we've lost from COVID these last couple of years, be able to get caught up and refocus. Because if we can do that and get module 4 done, we've only got 2 left. So, we're getting close to the end, our end, not the end of the world. We're close to the end of the world too, but as far as our course, we'll see. Maybe it'll keep going until the rapture. I don't know, but anyway, so please keep that time open on your calendar, and more details to come on that. But the plan will be to gather in Banawa together and be able to get back on track. Okay. And we won't have all these internet problems because we'll be together. So
Hopefully World War III will not happen.
yeah, anything can take place, right? These next couple months, we'll see. But Lord willing. But again, thank you for your patience and your perseverance, brothers. I know this has not been easy with everything that's happened. So just stay with it. And let's encourage our other brothers who've kind of fallen off. They've backslidden away from the class. We need to call them to return to the elect.
I have a
Repent and
question.
return.
Oh yeah, John.
Is it okay? Like, there are some brothers who have like totally stopped joining or doing their assignments, but will they still be able to join the class, the physical class? Like, if
Yeah, I want to make it such that guys can sort of restart, feel like there's an opportunity to restart. So I'm going to try to come up with, how we can do that, sort of get us, back to a place where we're kind of have some momentum again. So my hope is to, as we gather, we'll do some discussion of the syllabus. I'll give you guys the full syllabus in print, so you have that. I'm planning on doing some workshops together so that we can work on assignments while we're there, and I can be there to help. And then some of you, if you've got your sermons ready, we can get those done so that we can sort of get people at least caught up into module 4, and then in maybe October or something like that, I'll come back for module 5.
October na sadlab.
What's that?
We're excited.
Yeah. So that's the hope, is to try to get us, recovered and back on track. So yeah, if guys have sort of, several guys have stopped or just been struggling. So I want to try to provide opportunity. If anyone wants to, get back in, that we can do that.
I don't know if you remember Vicmar and Manny.
Yes.
with him.
Yeah. And you guys can
Give
let
him-
them know that too. I mean, I'm going to say that, but I think it would help if you tell them too that I really, because we've already, they already invested time to do the first 3 modules. So they're already, halfway, so to speak, at least. So I want to at least try to provide opportunity to help them come back in so they can finish the second half. And again, if we can do that, we'll be done next year, this time next year, Lord willing, and have graduation maybe next, June or something like that. So, all right. All right, any other questions?